Chapter 4, The DNA of the 3C Model. My friend Dr. Chris Wakehorse used to work for the James Cancer Research Institute at Ohio State University. While he was there, Dr. Wakehorse and his team of researchers gained notoriety for conducting breakthrough research on deoxyribonucleic acid, better known as DNA. In essence, DNA holds the blueprint for almost everything there is to know about us. The color of our hair, certain aspects of our personality, and even our vulnerability to certain types of diseases. As DNA is passed down from generation to generation, we notice patterns and similarities between parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents. We often hear things like, "Oh, she's got her mother's eye," or "Wow, he looks just like his grandfather." The same is true of every local church. Each church has its own DNA, its own blueprint or fingerprint, if you will. If you look closely at its blueprint, you can tell many things about a local church. So, launching a cell based congregation requires that we start with the most fundamental attributes and assure these become part of the DNA of every group. Several years ago, I had the privilege of spending a week with Pastor Steve Cordell and his staff. Steve was the founding and lead pastor of the Crossroads Church in the Pittsburgh metro area. During our time together, I began to understand the DNA of a cell-based congregation. You'll find much of what I've learned in his book, The Church in Many Houses, Reaching Our Community Through Cell-Based Ministry. Steve planted the Crossroads Church using the best models available, keeping up with the trends and forming the church around proven methods of church growth. But after about 7 years, he began to recognize that even though he had a growing congregation, people were being trained to be church members instead of disciple makers. They had become comfortable with membership activities such as attending worship regularly, believing the fundamental doctrine of the church, contributing money, living a moral life, and serving where they needed and were able. Pastor Steve realized the church's DNA had to change. He began to see that the church should be formed around cells and celebration, and to have one without the other would be like trying to fly a plane with only one wing. Over a period of time, Pastor Steve led the church in making 5 major shifts, from growing deeper to reaching outward, from membership to disciple maker, from educating to equipping, from programs to relationships, and from a church with cells to a church that is cells. He taught that cells are the most basic expressions of church. The essential purposes of the church are fulfilled through the cell, and corporate worship springs from the life-on-life experiences in the smaller groups. Corporate worship was not an event to attend. It was a community of believers coming together to celebrate. People didn't go to church. They realized they were the church. So Pastor Steve spelled out the fundamental principles of a cell-based church. Number 1, cell groups are not inward focused, but outward focused. The cell-based church is to help equip Christians for the ministry of making disciples who make disciples. Cell-based churches employ a distinctive and deliberate disciple-making strategy. Cell groups were more than just a Bible study. At its essence, a cell group is a set of Christ-centered relationships focused primarily on evangelism and discipleship. They understood that discipleship is better done in a personal, relational context. When I arrived at Crossroads Church on a cold Pittsburgh morning in February, I entered the building and was greeted by the children's pastor. And within seconds, this young staff member told me how she came to know the Lord and what a difference he had made in her life. She handed me off to a volunteer who showed me to our meeting area. And wouldn't you know it, before our journey ended, I heard yet another story of how Christ had transformed this person's life. Over and over throughout the week, I heard story after story of transformed lives. At the beginning of the day, I was invited to stay at the home of one of the church members, and wouldn't you know it, every evening we would stay up late into the night discussing how God had been changing lives through cell groups. Today, after over 20 years, the Crossroads Church is a vibrant, disciple making community that worships in 5 different locations throughout the Pittsburgh area. Let's talk about contextual, missional, and reproducible. These 3 aspects should be part of every facet of the 3C model: contextual, missional, and reproducible. Contextual means small groups can relate the gospel to people with all of its cultural nuances in a particular context. The gospel can be presented in a way relevant and understandable to people from different cultural backgrounds. By being contextual, small groups can effectively reach people where they are and speak to their needs. Missional means small groups are focused on the Great Commission and are seeking to be faithful to Jesus' call to go and make disciples of all nations. Missional small groups are committed to winning new people to Christ, discipling them in their faith, and training them to become disciple makers. Small groups that are reproducible can reproduce themselves in a different cultural context. This means the gospel is not limited to one particular context. Small groups can exponentially multiply themselves, spreading the gospel message to new people and new communities. Reproducibility also means that small groups are not limited by language and cultural barriers, but can be adapted to meet the needs of a different people group. Understand that the Great Commission isn't just about going forth into the world to proclaim the good news to Jesus and getting people saved, healed, and delivered. It's about discipling people. One leadership model is very simple. It goes, I do it, you watch. I do it, you help. You do it, I watch. And then you do it, and I move on. Discipling leaders is always a birthing, teaching, training, equipping, and releasing process. Disciples reproduce the Christ that is within them, the hope of glory.